So our next speaker, wow, I've worked with Jason the last 3 years. He's been doing virtual conferences for us. He's been doing now back to physical. He's the leader when it comes to threat intelligence. Jason is an internationally experienced intelligence and cybersecurity leader who possesses 15 years of experience innovating at the intersection of cybersecurity, operations technology throughout his career and published and presented at the world's top cybersecurity conferences. Jason is currently at CrowdStrike, where he leads a global team of cyber threat professionals, apply threat intelligence into cybersecurity operations, as well as into the enterprise. Prior to CrowdStrike, he was at Deloitte, where he developed a cyber intelligence cybersecurity program for Fortune 500 companies and the US government. Guess what Jason did when he was in the Army? Threat intelligence and intelligence. Welcome Jason to the stage, please. Thank you.
All right, everyone, day 2. Good to be back. And so today, I'm going to talk about a little different side of the threat that we've been seeing. Yesterday, we spoke about e-crime. We spoke about things like ransomware and access brokers, and we spoke about the expanding threat, talked about volume, talked about the increasing amount of attacks and the increasing complexity. And today I'm going to introduce to you another side of the problem. And the way that we're going to start is we're going to think about not just the threat itself, but we're going to think about what I call the attack surface, which begs the question, what is an attack surface? Well, it's kind of like the name implies, right? The attack surface is how much space the adversary has to attack us. And so think of it like this, right? The smaller the attack surface, the less devices we have, the harder it is for us to be attacked. So let's go back in the day. We go back to, let's say, like the 1990s, 1980s, 1990s. I think I was like 10 years old when I got my first computer. It was 1995. Got my first computer. I did not know what the internet was. I think I finally got the internet like maybe 1998, 1999 or something like that. Back then, very few devices, very few networks, very small attack surface, right? And yet, here we are today. We live in a totally connected world. Every aspect of our world is connected. Everything that you can see, touch, is connected by something. Operational technology plays a big role in that. One interesting statistic is the one that I'm putting up here, which is the value of the ICS business is expected to grow from 106 billion in 2020 to 168 billion by 2026. So what does that mean? Well, it means that the attack surface, the opportunities for the adversary to attack us, are going to expand. And now take that back to what I said yesterday. So not only is the attack surface increasing, but the volume of threats is also increasing, and the complexity is also increasing. And so I think this poses a challenge. I'm going to pose the same challenge today that I posed yesterday. The threat is increasing, the attack surface is increasing, and yet the amount of us, the number of us that are here to solve the problem, not increasing at the same rate, right? So again, this is a fundamental challenge, that fundamental challenge being that the threat increases faster than our rate and our ability to respond to it. Avinash spoke about the Colonial Pipeline incident, and I'm actually from Virginia, and I remember literally going to fill up gas, and there were people putting gas in milk cartons, and I was so confused. I was like, what? Where am I? There are literally people putting gas in milk cartons. And what I think the Colonial Pipeline incident represents is the consequences of not doing this correctly. The consequences can be very severe. And when we think about the severity of those consequences, it's not just the oil and gas industry. Operational technology spans across every single critical aspect of society as we know it. It spans across manufacturing, energy, water, telecommunications, hospitals. Everything that we know, everything that holds our society together has an operational technology element to it. And I think that is kind of the critical aspect that we all need to be aware of, right? This isn't necessarily about computers anymore. This is about human society. If you have a family member who is in the hospital right now, they need the operational technology to function. If you have children who require power to connect to the internet and to have their education, then they require operational technology. If you ever plan on traveling on a plane or on a train, You require operational technology. Literally, this is the problem and this is the threat that could potentially pull society apart. And so I start with this because I want to express the magnitude of this problem. If this is a problem that if we do not correctly solve, one day it'll become a lot more severe than what happened in the colonial pipeline. And so when we think about critical infrastructure, one of the reasons that it's becoming more of a significant issue is that the physical and digital worlds are slowly but surely blending together. So a lot of people have this idea, they have this notion that you can air gap things, that the operational technology environment is air gapped, that it's somehow separate. And for those of you that are cybersecurity leaders that manage operational technology environments, I challenge you to ask yourself a very honest question. Is it really air gapped? How sure are you that it's air gapped? If you manage energy or if you manage a manufacturing center or whatever it is that you manage that has OT in it, ask yourself the question, truly, is it actually air gapped? Is it completely air gapped? How sure are you? Because the thing is, most places aren't that sure. What I'm showing you on the screen right now is something that's happening in the United States. This is happening right now. Right now, over the last 6 months or so, there are United States power providers where foreign adversaries are accessing those power providers and disrupting uninterruptible power supplies. Our best guess is that it is likely Russia, likely in retaliation to the Ukraine conflict. Do we know this for certain? We do not. But again, the reason I present this example is I want to show how easy this is. This is happening all the time. And the reason that it happens is actually less complex than we think. For example, in the case that I'm showing up here, what we're seeing potentially is basically the use of default credentials. So the use of default credentials for electrical power substations, whoever was administering it decided, I'm not going to change the credentials, and that resulted in 3 high-profile vulnerabilities being exploited. One of the terms that you'll see in vulnerability exploitation that is particularly relevant within the OT space is remote code execution. And so now I'm putting my Army hat back on. So back in the day when I used to be in the Army, one of the things I got the experience of is being on the other side, doing offensive things, learning how to do offensive things. The ability to do remote code execution is one of the things that allowed us to achieve our objectives. And if the US Army did it, well, then I would imagine that also other militaries would do it, such as Russia, Iran, China, North Korea. And so part of this is that we need to learn to think not just as a defender, but we need to learn to think like the offense. What would the offense want to do? What would Iran want to do right now? What would be the triggers that would cause a nation like Iran to attack operational technology? What would be the way that they would do it? What would be the capabilities that they would leverage? How exactly would they target us? And I think that's the things that we have to start thinking about. We need to start thinking about the hard questions now. And that's one of the reasons that I like presenting on topics around what's happening in foreign battle spaces. So for example, this conflict in Ukraine. Yes, Ukraine is very far away from Saudi Arabia, but my logic on presenting to you on what's happening in Ukraine is this. You basically have 2 ways of learning about a threat. The first way of learning about a threat that I do not recommend is experiencing the threat. Experiencing a threat is a very harsh way to learn. The second way that we can learn is by studying that threat abroad and seeing how it's manifesting in other areas throughout the world. And so let's talk a little bit about how adversaries engage in these types of attacks. Probably the best way to think of it is it's always from the outside in. And what I'm showing you is the Purdue model for ICS security. Every adversary that attacks an OT environment will typically start from the IT environment, which I think is an interesting dynamic to be aware of. A lot of people have this perception that IT and OT are 2 distinctly different worlds that don't touch each other. In almost every single OT attack that I am personally aware of, whether it's from my experience at CrowdStrike or my experience before CrowdStrike, almost every single OT attack that I am personally aware of had some type of IT nexus to it. And typically the way that it would work is it would start something like this. It would actually begin with IT network reconnaissance. So again, let's put the adversary hat on. Let's think like Iran. Let's think like a criminal. Let's think about how we would do it. Well, you might begin with what you have access to. And what is easier to access, the IT or the OT side? Probably the IT. And within the IT side, they're looking for configuration documentation. Their goal is to do reconnaissance. Their goal is to see how you think, to see how you operate. And then once they gain access to that, they will test things out. They will try out different scenarios because they know that once they go into your OT environment, they're only going to have one chance. Why are they only going to have one chance? Well, if you catch them, you're going to fix the problem. However they got in, you're going to make sure that doesn't happen again. And so the sophisticated adversary is going to test out their attacks prior to engaging in the attacks. And that's when you'll see the OT system intrusion. Once they have a sufficient amount of confidence, once they actually know exactly what they want to do, what they want to achieve, that is when they will make the leap from the IT side to the OT side. And remember what I said earlier, how many of you are truly, truly confident that your OT is separated from your IT? I would imagine that many of us are not truly confident in that. And that's when, of course, they achieve their objectives. Once they get into the OT environments, as we are all aware, those OT environments have legacy operating systems, legacy capabilities, and pretty much zero security, right? Oftentimes, the way that we protect the OT environments is by hoping that we can somehow segment it away from access. And so again, this is a challenge that is posed to us from a societal perspective. Let's talk about some of the threats to operational technology that we are seeing. One of the more common threats that we see comes from what I call, not just what I call, but what a lot of cybersecurity professionals call the Big Four. The Big Four nation states, to include Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And the reason that they're called the Big Four is because they engage in a very large amount of malicious attacks. And not just attacks against other governments, because as we are all aware, pretty much every government engages in offensive attacks, the United States included, obviously. But the difference, I would argue, between governments like virtuous governments such as like the United States or Saudi Arabia, as opposed to Russia, Iran, China, North Korea, is that I would say that nation states such as us, we engage in offensive operations for the purpose of securing our people, for the purpose of securing international security, whereas the Big Four that I'm putting up here, they engage in offensive operations for a different reason. They go after the private sector, they go after commercial entities, they go after critical infrastructure. There's lots of examples of this. Again, like I said, right now, power, telecommunications, transportation, all of that being targeted by Russia against Ukraine. We already know what Iran has done in the past. We know about the Shamoon incident. We know that Iran is actively targeting different entities within the Gulf, lots of different telecom entities. Obviously, there might be an IT nexus to that, but potentially also an OT nexus to it. Of course, there's China, and the threat posed to OT by China is different. China is more so of a intellectual property type threat, trying to understand how our OT works so they can use that to empower their own economies. And then lastly, North Korea. From a North Korea perspective, again, we see a lot of similar tradecraft and a lot of similar techniques against their regional adversaries, to include South Korea, as well as other nations within the East Asia region. So again, like I said earlier, the objective is to study what the adversary does in other locations so that we can be more aware of it if it were to one day happen to us. And when we think about the common motivations of these types of attacks, there are three primary motivations: destructive, espionage, and financial gain. So let's go ahead and try to have a deeper understanding of these motivations. The first motivation we'll go over is destructive. One of the best examples of this that is happening right now is an adversary that CrowdStrike refers to as Voodoo Bear. According to the CERT Ukraine, Voodoo Bear engaged in a targeted attack against the Ukrainian energy sector, which resulted in high voltage electrical access to various power substations. What they were able to do is gain network access and then schedule an attack that took power out. The result of this was destructive malware, and it was successfully executed, and they were able to shut down power to certain regions. So again, why would they want to do this? Well, one good reason to want to do this is to support military operations. So it goes back to what I was saying. We need to think like the adversary. How might this happen to us? For what reasons might it happen to us? What kind of malware might the adversary use? And like I said earlier, one of the best ways to learn about the adversary is to study them. And the good news is there is lots of intelligence available on what they are capable of. And this slide appears to not be appearing correctly, but that's not the point, right? The point is there's lots of precedent. Russia didn't just start attacking Ukraine this year. They weren't just operational this year. There's a long history of these types of attacks. And I think our goal as cybersecurity professionals, again, is to learn in ways that don't require us to have to experience the attacks, but rather to learn from history, to learn from how this has happened in the past, and then to apply these lessons to what might happen to us in the future. The next motivation we'll go over is espionage attacks. You heard me say earlier that China often engages in OT attacks for the purpose of espionage. And one of the primary things that we see is espionage relating to their 5-year plan. So one of the interesting things about the China Nexus adversary set is that they will release these 5-year plans every 5 years. So every 5 years, they'll release their priorities. They'll say their priorities are maybe integrated circuits or rocket technology, telecommunications technology, health technology, so on and so forth. And then every 5 years, the espionage that we see follows that 5-year plan. And so one of the things that we can think about from an OT operational technology perspective is, does our company, do our organizations possess aspects that would be relative and relevant to China's 5-year plan? If so, if you possess a technology that is relevant to China's 5-year plan, then you are potentially a good target for espionage. So this goes back to thinking like the adversary. And one of the last motivations that we see in the OT space is financially motivated attacks. Financially motivated attacks obviously span across all different types of technology, right? Of course, not just OT, but also the IT environment. And so, of course, like pretty much every other speaker here, I'm also going to talk about Colonial Pipeline. And I think the interesting thing about Colonial Pipeline is that, yes, it's a gas pipeline. Yes, it's an energy provider. But the problem with Colonial Pipeline actually occurred on the IT side, which is interesting, right? The adversary was able to shut down 50% of the oil and gas to the eastern portion of the United States, not necessarily by compromising the OT side, but by compromising the IT side. They were able to levy an OT effect by compromising the IT side. So I think that's a very interesting lesson learned. It goes back to what I was saying earlier. These are not separate problems. If you want to secure, sorry, how do I go backwards? There we go. If you want to secure the OT side, then it is critical that you secure the IT side. For example, with Colonial Pipeline, literally the way that started was valid credentials. Somebody used valid credentials and logged right in. So remember what a lot of the speakers, to include myself, said yesterday. We talked about the identity-based threat. We said that identity was 50% of the problem, or 80% of the problem, rather. If identity is 80% of the problem, and identity is on your IT side, if you want to protect OT, then protect identity on the IT side, right? It's about seeing the problem in its entirety. It's about the ability to understand how the various aspects of the problem connect to each other. In the cybersecurity vision, or in the cybersecurity industry, we sometimes have tunnel vision. We sometimes believe that if we solve this one problem, that you'll be okay, right? But if all the problems are connected, then that might not necessarily be the case. So again, I want to kind of echo this message, and I know I'm echoing this message over and over again, but we have an OT impact, an OT outage that was caused by an IT activity. And so I think that's kind of one of the primary messages that I want to get across, right? It is all interconnected. At the end of the day, we do not have singular problems with singular solutions. We have multifaceted, complex problems that require multifaceted, complex, and maybe not so complex solutions, but rather holistic solutions that are able to solve multiple areas of the problem set. Obviously, ransomware is a big aspect of this, right? But I think the interesting thing about ransomware is, what does ransomware primarily target? Manufacturing, industrial engineering, industries that are very heavily OT based. Why would ransomware go after OT environments? Well, because they know that if they're able to shut down those environments, that the pain that you will experience is maximized. So not only is OT a critical aspect of how society needs to operate, but it is also commonly targeted by criminals because they know that that is an area where they can maximize your pain. So I'm going to close today the same way I closed yesterday. What this ultimately boils down to is we need to think like the adversary. If we're going to think like the adversary, then we need to use intelligence. We need to engage in threat hunting. We need to proactively go after the adversary. Do not wait for the adversary to come to you. If you are not doing intelligence, if you are not doing hunting, if you are not proactively going after the adversary, then what you are choosing to do is you are choosing to wait to be hit. The previous speaker right before me, Avinash, said that it's not a matter of if, but a matter of when. And I promise you that if you are not proactively seeking the adversary, then your probability of being breached is higher. If you are waiting to be hit, your probability of being breached will go up. So again, it kind of all boils down to this. Almost every single conference that I speak at, every single customer that I talk to, I tell them the exact same thing. And it really does boil down to this. Your ability to defeat advanced cyber threats rests almost entirely on how well you understand the problem. It begins in your mind. It begins with your strategy. Samir, right before me, he said, what is more important? Is it strategy or execution? I would argue that almost all of it is strategy. If you have a proper understanding, if you have a good strategy, the rest of it will come together. The rest of it will naturally unfold. If you understand the problem well enough, then everything in front of you will make sense. Conversely, if you do not understand the problem, let's say you have a poor strategy but amazing execution, then you will execute on a poor strategy, and therefore it won't work. So that's all I have. Again, thank you for your time, and at this time I'll take any questions that the audience might have.
Wow. Wow. Thank you, Jason. That was awesome.